The night before the storm, the hills of the frontier were quiet, painted in gold by the last light of a dying sun. A thin wind carried the smell of wood smoke across the valley, where a lone cabin stood against the vast emptiness of the plains. Inside, the man who owned that cabin, a rancher with tired eyes and calloused hands, thought his troubles were no different from any other homesteaders, whether cattle in the long shadow of loneliness. But by dawn, his world would be unrecognizable. It all began when a woman appeared at his gate. Worn and limping, her dark hair tangled from days on the trail, her face pale with both strength and suffering. She was Apache, proud and silent, carrying herself with a dignity that no wound could steal. She spoke little, but in her hand was a silver coin no larger than a button, and with it, she bought what no one else would have dared to sell so cheaply: a man's horse and his ranch. The rancher hesitated. A horse was his lifeline, his only true partner on endless rides across the dry earth. And the cabin was all he owned in the world. Yet something in her gaze, part fire, part sorrow, kept him from turning her away. He told himself it was only $1, a kindness to a soul in need, and he would find another way to survive. What he did not see was the shadow that trailed behind her, the invisible ties of blood and kinship that would soon pull his home into the center of a storm. That night, prairie seemed still. The moon rose pale and sharp over the hills, and coyotes cried in the distance. The man sat by the fire, watching the woman tend her wound in silence, wondering who she was and what path had brought her here. Her eyes never revealed the whole truth, but the weight of secrets clung to her, like the smell of dust after rain. He felt unease prick at him, but it was too late to undo the trade. At first light, sound came low, a steady drum of hooves rolling like thunder across the valley. When he stepped outside, his heart sank. The ridges that framed his land were no longer empty. Riders lined the hills in every direction, their silhouettes cutting against the rising sun. The smoke from their torches drifted downward, curling around his cabin like a warning. The woman stood at his door, her face unreadable, and for the first time, he understood what her presence truly meant. He had given up his horse and his home for one silver coin, and in return, he had inherited the fury of her people. The tribe had come for her, and now they had come for him. And as the riders began to descend, their cries echoing through the valley, the rancher realized the sun might not set on him again. The riders came down slow at first. Their lines spread wide, like a net closing in on a single fish. The sound of their horses filled the air, hooves striking earth in a rhythm that made the ground tremble underfoot. The rancher stood rooted in place, his hand brushing against the worn handle of his rifle, leaning against the wall. Though he knew it would do little good against so many, his eyes shifted to the woman at the doorway. She did not move nor speak, but her steady gaze made it clear she had known this would come. The cabin was small and weathered, its logs darkened by years of wind and dust. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, but the warmth inside felt distant now, as though the walls themselves knew they were trapped in a siege. The rancher's life had been one of solitude until that evening, and he wondered how quickly everything could change. Just the day before, his worries had been about cattle wandering too far into the hills, with a creek running dry before autumn. Now he was staring down the possibility of losing everything: his land, his freedom, maybe even his life. He glanced again at the woman. Her wound was wrapped with a strip of cloth torn from her dress, and though her face betrayed no pain, he could see her stance falter slightly, as though the strength in her legs might give at any moment. She was younger than he first thought, though hardship had aged her eyes. There was something in them that carried both defiance and sorrow, and the more he looked, the more he realized she was not simply a stranger passing through. She was the spark that had set fire to the kindling he had unknowingly stacked around his home. The riders slowed as they reached the flat of the valley, encircling the cabin with sharp precision. They were Apache warriors, their faces stern, their bodies tense with purpose. Spears and rifles gleamed in the dawn light, and their horses shifted restlessly, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold morning air. The rancher felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing in, each one filled with suspicion, anger, or something deeper he could not yet name. He remembered tales he'd heard in town, whispered by traders and miners over mugs of whiskey, stories of raids, of settlements burned, of revenge that stretched for generations. But those were always stories told from one side, colored by fear and rumor. Standing there now, with the earth vibrating under the hooves of their horses, he realized how little he truly understood. The woman stepped forward, her shoulders straight though her limp was visible. She raised her hand, palm out, and the riders slowed to stillness. A silence settled so heavy it seemed the wind itself held its breath. She spoke then, words in a language the rancher could not follow. But the tone was clear, firm, commanding, filled with authority born of blood. The warriors listened, some with narrowed eyes, others with faint nods, though none lowered their weapons. The rancher shifted uncomfortably, caught between her world and his own. Who was she to them? A daughter? A sister? A leader who had been lost and now found? And what did that make him? The man who had given her refuge? The man who had traded away his horse and his land without knowing what debt he had accepted in return? The sun climbed higher, spilling its light over the hills, and every shadow seemed sharper. The rancher's thoughts ran back to the moment she first appeared, stumbling across his land with dust on her face and fire in her eyes. He wondered if she had chosen him, if she had known her people would follow. If his cabin had simply been the stage for a play already written. Inside, the fire burned low, and the smell of coffee still clung to the air. It was strange to think how ordinary the night had begun. He remembered the way she had sat in silence by the hearth, her hands steady as she bound her wound, her eyes never straying toward him, except once. When the light caught her face, and he saw the weight of miles she had traveled, she had not asked for pity. She had not asked for shelter. Only a trade, 1 silver coin for his horse and his ranch. He had laughed at the absurdity, then given in, not out of greed, but because something in her presence made refusal impossible. Now, as he stood with the warrior's circle closing tighter, he began to understand. The coin had not been payment. It had been a mark, a seal on a bargain far greater than he could see. The woman spoke again, her voice steady but urgent. The words rose and fell like music, filled with rhythms older than the hills. The rancher could not follow the meaning, but he caught fragments of emotion, augur, sorrow, resolve. She pointed once toward him, and every eye followed. His chest tightened as the circle of warriors seemed to lean closer, their attention shifting from her to the stranger who had taken her in. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to tell them he had meant no harm, but his throat felt dry as sand. The truth was, he did not know what role he played in their story. To them, perhaps, he was a thief who had dared to lay claim to what was never his. Perhaps they saw him as an enemy, a man who had taken their wounded sister into his house as though she were something to be bought and sold. The tension grew thicker with every heartbeat. The horses stamped and snorted, and the warriors held their ground. The woman's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment he thought he saw a plea, or maybe a warning. He could not tell which. The rancher's mind wandered to the life he had built out here, far from towns and law. Every fence post he had driven, every scar on his hands, every drop of sweat poured into the soil, it all felt fragile now, like a sandcastle before a tide. He had always thought of his land as his sanctuary, a place where the world's troubles could not find him. Yet here he was, surrounded. His fate tangled in the secrets of a woman he barely knew. The silence broke when one of the warriors shouted, his voice sharp as an arrow. Others joined in, the sound rising like a storm wind. The rancher felt his pulse quicken, his hand drifting closer to the rifle at his side. He knew it would be folly to draw it, but instinct made him cling to the only shield he had ever trusted. The woman raised her hand again, commanding them to stillness. The voices fell quiet, though the fire in their eyes did not dim. She turned back to him then, and for the first time since she had arrived, she spoke in words he could understand. You gave me your horse. You gave me your land. But do you know what you truly gave away? Her voice was steady, but the question struck him like a blow. He searched her face for meaning, but she offered none. The warriors watched, waiting for his answer, though he had none to give. The sun was high now, the day fully broken, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. He felt the weight of 1,000 choices pressing on him. The choice to open his gate, the choice to accept her coin. The choice to stand his ground now when every instinct told him to flee, and as the circle tightened one step closer, he realized the story had only just begun, and there was no turning back. The valley felt smaller with every passing minute. As though the circle of riders had squeezed the air itself into a thin, brittle shell, the rancher stood with his boots planted in the dirt, sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. He tried not to show fear, but his hands betrayed him, flexing and curling against his sides as though they longed for work that would steady them. The Apache woman had returned to silence after her last words, and her silence weighed heavier than any threat. He studied her, searching for something that might give him a clue. The way she stood, shoulders firm, though her body leaned ever so slightly from the pain in her side. The way the warrior's eyes followed her every move, as if she carried authority that went deeper than blood. The way she seemed both shield and blade, caught between him and her people. She was the bridge, and he was the stranger, stranded on one side, waiting to see whether she would let him cross or leave him to the flood. The riders' faces told their own story. Some were carved in stone, hard and unreadable, their rifles angled toward the dirt but ready to rise. Others burned with anger, their eyes flashing at him with suspicion, as though his very breath was an insult. A few glanced at the woman with concern, as though her wound demanded swifter action than this standoff allowed. They had come for her, that much was certain. But what they would do with him remained a question that gnawed at his chest. The rancher's mind drifted, unbidden, to the lonely years behind him. He had come west to escape the press of crowded towns and the memory of debts he could not pay. Out here, the land was harsh, but honest. A man's back and his will were enough to build a home. For years, he had spoken to no one but his horse, cooked his own meals in silence, and slept with nothing but coyotes for company. That solitude had become his armor. But now, with a tribe encircling his cabin and a wounded woman marking him with her bargain, felt more exposed than ever before. The woman finally broke the silence. She spoke again in her tongue, her voice low but cutting through the still air. The warriors shifted, their attention split between her and the man she had traded with. A debate sparked among them, voices rising and clashing like steel against steel. Though he could not follow the words, the rancher knew the sound of judgment when he heard it. His fate was being weighed, his worth measured, and the outcome was anything but certain. One warrior, broader than the rest, urged his horse forward a few steps. His hair fell long against his shoulders, and the sun glinted off the steel barrel of his rifle. He pointed toward the rancher, then toward the cabin, and spoke with a voice that carried across the circle. Whatever he said stirred the others, their murmurs swelling like a restless tide. The rancher felt the urge to defend himself, to shout that he had not wronged them, that he had only offered help to one of their own. But the words caught in his throat. The woman answered the broad-shouldered warrior, her voice sharp, defiant. He did not interrupt her, but his glare cut deep, like a knife pressed against her will. When she finished, he spat into the dirt, then turned his horse away with a snap of the reins. The circle rippled with reactions, some nodding, some scowling, others murmuring to one another in hushed tones. The rancher felt the ground shifting beneath him. He was not just a bystander. He was a piece of the conflict itself. His cabin, his land, his horsehall were symbols now, tied to meanings he could not fully grasp. The woman's coin had not bought safety. It had bought him into the heart of a struggle older than his years, older than the fences he had hammered into the ground. He wondered what the woman carried with her besides her wound. Perhaps she had fled something within her own people. Perhaps she had betrayed them, or perhaps she carried knowledge that made her dangerous. And now, by giving her shelter, he had stepped into the shadows of that same danger. Inside the cabin, his belongings sat unchanged, the worn saddle leaning against the wall, the cracked lantern on the table, the Bible gathering dust by the window. Each object told the story of a man who wanted nothing more than to carve a quiet life from a harsh land. But outside, that life was unraveling, thread by thread. The sun crept higher, shadows shrinking, and still the circle held. Tension wove itself into every heartbeat, every glance. The rancher's stomach tightened, though hunger was the farthest thing from his mind. He thought of his horse, gone now with the woman's bargain. That horse had carried him through storms, through long nights on the range. It was more than an animal. It was survival itself. To lose it had been a blow he thought he could bear. But now, with the cabin itself slipping from his grasp, he wondered if he had traded away not just his means of survival, but his very right to call this place home. The woman turned toward him at last. Her face was calm, but her eyes were filled with shadows. "They will not wait much longer," she said, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "What do they want from me?" he asked, his throat dry. Her gaze held steady. "They want to know why you helped me. They want to know what you expect in return. They want to know if you are their enemy or something else." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't expect anything. I only did what I thought was right." She studied him as though testing the weight of his words. Then she looked away, back to her people, and he realized his truth might not matter. It was not about what he meant, but what they believed. The broad-shouldered warrior shouted again, and the circle shifted. Horses pawed at the earth, restless as though they sensed the decision pressing near. The rancher tightened his grip on the strap of his rifle, though he prayed he would never have to use it. The woman raised her voice once more, speaking with urgency, her words rolling like thunder through the still air. The warriors listened, their faces hard, their eyes cutting between her and the stranger who had given her shelter. When she finished, silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. The rancher knew the moment of choice was close. Whatever they decided, his life would never return to what it had been. The cabin, the land, the quiet years of solitude, they were no longer his alone. He had been pulled into a current that carried more than one man's fate. The circle of riders did not move, but their stillness was louder than any charge. The woman's breath came shallow, her wound tugging at her strength, but her eyes remained fixed on the broad-shouldered warrior. Between them, something unspoken passed, something layered with years of history he could not touch. The rancher stood in the middle of it all, the weight of two worlds pressing down on him. And in that fragile silence, he knew the conflict had only deepened. Pulling him further into a storm he had no power to stop. The wind stirred the grass on the hills, bending it like waves, and the riders tightened their grip on their weapons. The woman's coin, the horse, the cabin symbols, now, all of them, tangled in threads of loyalty and betrayal. He wondered if this moment would end in blood, or if the sun would fall before the decision was made. Either way, he felt the truth settle into his bones. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of their story now, whether he willed it or not. The day stretched long. The light grew harsher with each passing hour. The valley had turned into a stage, the circle of riders unbroken, the cabin at its center like a lone island in a restless sea. The rancher could feel the weight of every gaze pressing on him, judging him, measuring him, waiting for some sign of weakness. His throat was dry, his chest heavy, and yet he forced himself to stand tall, though his legs ached to run. The Apache woman remained close, but not beside him. She stood apart, her figure straight against the sun, her wound hidden beneath the cloth she had wrapped around herself. Her face betrayed nothing, but her silence was sharp, like a knife balanced on its edge. She had spoken for him, that much was clear. But he could not tell if she had saved him or only delayed the inevitable. The broad-shouldered warrior returned to the center of the circle, his horse stamping the earth in agitation. He raised his hand, and the low murmur of voices died. He spoke then, his words strong and deliberate, echoing across the valley. Though the rancher could not understand the language, the meaning was clear enough. The man was calling for action, judgment, a decision that would end this standoff before. The sun sank below the ridges. The rancher's hands itched against the strap of his rifle, but he dared not move. His mind raced back through every choice that had led him here. If he had turned the woman away, he would still be alone, safe in his cabin with his horse tethered by the corral. But would he have been safe, truly? Or would the tribe have come anyway, finding him guilty not of giving, but of refusing? He realized now there had never been a choice at all. The moment she appeared, his path had been set. The woman spoke again, her voice louder than before, cutting into the warrior's declaration. Her tone was fierce, filled with something more than defense. She was not pleading, she was commanding. The rancher felt his breath catch as her words rolled across the circle like a storm wind. The warriors shifted, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Their unity was splintering. He could feel the crack widen with every sentence she spoke. But cracks could collapse as easily as they could divide. One young rider near the edge of the circle broke from the silence with a sharp cry, thrusting his spear toward the sky. His horse pawed at the dirt and his voice rang out in a challenge that stirred the others. The air thickened with tension, the circle trembling on the edge of violence. The rancher's pulse hammered in his ears. His hand tightened on his rifle, though he still prayed he would not have to use it. His cabin behind him felt suddenly small, too fragile to shield him from what was coming. He thought of the years he had spent raising its walls, of the nights he had sat by the fire with only the sound of the wind for company. All of it, every memory, now stood on the edge of being swallowed by forces far larger than himself. The woman turned toward him then, her eyes fierce, her face pale with pain. "Do not move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to root him to the ground. He froze. His breath felt shallow, his lungs fighting for air. Around them, the riders shifted, their weapons glinting in the light. The broad-shouldered warrior's glare locked onto him, hard and cold. In that moment, the rancher understood he was the test. His actions now would decide whether the ground beneath him turned to blood, or whether another dawn might rise over this valley with him still alive. The woman raised her hand again, commanding silence. Her words poured out in a steady stream, her voice cutting through the storm of unrest. She pointed once toward the rancher, then toward the land around them, then finally back to herself. Each gesture carried weight, her body telling a story even he could follow. She was binding them together, weaving his fate with hers. Whether he willed it or not, the broad-shouldered warrior spat into the dirt again, his face twisted with anger. He barked a reply that made several riders cry out in agreement. The woman's jaw tightened, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, but her eyes never wavered. She answered him with words that struck like arrows, quick and sharp, and for a moment silence followed. The rancher's stomach churned. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to beg for understanding. But he knew his voice would be nothing but noise here. His only choice was to stand still, to trust a woman he barely knew, and to hope that whatever story she told of him was enough to spare his life. Time dragged like a slow river, each second thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. The riders' horses grew restless, stamping and snorting, their impatience mirroring the men who rode them. The sun had reached its peak, and heat shimmered off the valley floor. Sweat stung the rancher's eyes, but he dared not lift a hand to wipe it away. Finally, the broad-shouldered warrior turned his horse sharply, circling closer to the cabin. His eyes locked onto the rancher, his stare a blade pressed against his throat. He barked a single word, sharp and final, and the air seemed to tighten around it. The woman stepped forward, blocking his path, her wounded leg trembling but refusing to give way. Her hand lifted once more, palm out, her voice ringing clear in defiance. The circle held its breath. The rancher realized then that the moment was no longer about his horse, or his cabin, or even the coin that had passed between them. It was about something deeper, about loyalty, about trust, about who had the right to claim this land and who would be cast out of it. He was no longer just a man on the edge of their world. He was part of their story now. Whether they saw him as brother or enemy, the broad-shouldered warrior raised his rifle. The sound of metal shifting against leather cut through the silence like thunder. The woman did not move. The rancher's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like the toll of a bell. His hand tightened on his own weapon, though he knew drawing it might seal his fate. Every rider's eyes locked on him, waiting, watching. The valley was silent, save for the wind whispering through the grass. The circle had reached its breaking point. One breath more, one wrong move, and the silence would shatter into violence. And as the rancher stood caught between the rifle aimed at him and the woman's steady defiance? He knew the story had reached the edge of its highest cliff. The fall was coming. The rifle in the broad-shouldered warrior's hands seemed to hang in the air forever, the barrel catching the light, promising a fate no man could outrun. The rancher felt the world narrow to a single thread. One wrong move, one flicker of fear, and it would snap. Yet just as the silence reached its breaking point, the Apache woman spoke. Her voice cut sharp, like a whip cracking in dry air. Her words rolled out fast. Her tone fierce but steady, and the rancher could see her strength pouring through every syllable. She spoke not only to the warrior, but to the whole circle, her eyes sweeping across them, pulling each man into her story. Even though he could not follow her language, he could feel the weight of it, heavy with truth, heavy with blood. The warrior did not lower his rifle at once. His jaw tightened, his breath flared in his chest, but something in her words gave him pause. His horse shifted, hooves thudding the dirt, and finally he barked back, his voice low and angry. But he did not fire. The woman's shoulders dropped, just slightly, as though she had bought them another moment of life. She turned to the rancher then, her eyes searching his. "You must understand," she said softly. "This is not about your cabin or your horse. It is about me. They think I betrayed them. They think I left them to die. And now you stand with me, so they see you as part of it." The rancher's throat tightened. "Then tell them the truth," he said. Her gaze held steady, sorrow glinting in the corners of her eyes. "The truth is not always enough. They want blood, or proof that I still belong to them." The rancher felt the earth tilt beneath him. He had given her his horse, his home, his shelter, thinking it was only a kindness. But now he realized he had stepped into the middle of a wound that stretched across families, across years. He was not just her savior, he was her witness, perhaps her only shield. The broad-shouldered warrior barked again, his hands slicing through the air. Two younger riders spurred their horses forward, circling close. The rancher stiffened, his hand tightening on his rifle.
"Oh."
But the woman held up her palm, warning him still. They dismounted, their boots stirring dust as they approached. Their eyes burned with suspicion, their hands gripping spears. They circled him, studying him like a wolf studies a trapped animal. One muttered something under his breath, spitting near the rancher's boots. The other jabbed the butt of his spear into the dirt. Close enough to make the rancher's legs flinch, the woman shouted again, her voice fierce, and the young warriors froze. They exchanged glances, their anger pulling against her command, but they did not strike. At last, they turned back, climbing onto their horses with jerks of the reins, their faces carved with frustration. The rancher exhaled, but his relief was shallow. The circle remained. The judgment had not yet fallen. The sun had begun to lean west, the shadows growing long across the hills. Hours had passed, but the tension had not loosened. The rancher could feel exhaustion creeping into his bones, his mind straining under the weight of uncertainty. Yet the woman remained upright, her wound wrapped tight, her face calm though pale. Her strength seemed drawn from some well far deeper than pain could touch. She spoke to him once more in a low voice. "They must hear my side, but if they do not accept it, they will take this land, and you with it." The rancher swallowed hard. He thought of his long years of labor, of every fence post, every scar, every night of hunger and cold. To lose it all to a conflict that was never his felt crueler than any hardship the land had dealt him. Yet as he looked at her, he saw that this place had always carried older claims than his. The broad-shouldered warrior raised his rifle again, but not to fire. Instead, he pointed it toward the horizon, then toward the cabin, then toward the woman. His words came like stones, sharp and unforgiving. He wanted a choice made, here and now. The woman's answer was quieter this time, but it carried. She spoke slowly, her eyes on the rancher, then on her people. The rancher saw the fire dim in some of the riders' faces, though others still glared with fury. Her voice wove through them like a thread, stitching something fragile but unbreakable. The silence that followed was long, broken only by the restless snorts of horses. Then, one by one, the riders began to turn their mounts. Some left quickly, as though unwilling to hear more. Others lingered, their eyes still heavy with doubt before pulling away. The circle loosened, breaking apart into smaller clusters. Only the broad-shouldered warrior remained, his stare locked on the rancher. For a moment, it seemed he might fire after all. His hand flexed on the rifle, his jaw clenched, his horse restless beneath him. But then he spat again into the dirt, wheeled his mount sharply, and galloped off toward the hills. The rancher stood frozen, unable to breathe, until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. The valley lay quiet again, the air heavy with what had almost been. The woman sank to her knees, her strength finally giving way. The rancher rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. Her breath came shallow, her wound darkening the cloth she had tied around herself. He carried her inside, laying her gently on the bed by the fire. For a long time neither spoke. The silence inside the cabin was different now, heavier, but also strangely fragile, like the moment after a storm when the world holds its breath. Finally, she whispered, her eyes barely open. "You gave me more than a horse, more than a home. You gave me a witness. That is why they could not kill you. To kill you would mean my story ended here, and they were not ready for it to end." The rancher sat beside her, staring at the flames. He thought of the tribe, of the broad-shouldered warrior's fury, of the choice that had hovered like a blade over both their lives. He knew this was not finished. The tribe would not forget, but for now, there was still life. For now, the cabin still stood. Days later, the woman's strength began to return. She moved slowly, but with purpose, as though each step was a promise to herself. The rancher watched her, wondering what path she would take once she was whole again. Would she return to her people? Would she vanish into the hills, leaving him with only the memory of a silver coin and the echo of her voice? Or would she remain, weaving her life into his, as unexpected and unyielding as the land itself? The nights grew colder, and the fire burned lower, but the rancher felt something shift within him. He had lived alone for so long, convinced solitude was his armor. Yet now, with her presence filling the cabin, he realized solitude had been a cage. The land was harsh, yes, but it was not meant to be carried alone. When dawn broke over the valley once more, the hills were empty, the riders gone. The cabin stood quiet, but it no longer felt small. The rancher stepped outside, the woman at his side, and they looked out together at the land stretched wide before them. The story of the coin, the horse, the cabin, and the tribe would linger, carried on whispers of wind through the grass. But in that moment, they were not enemies, not strangers. They were two souls bound by chance and choice, standing at the edge of something neither could yet name. The rancher knew the land would test them again. The tribe might return, and the past would always shadow their steps. But for now, the valley was still, the air was clear, and the day was theirs. And as the sun climbed over the ridges, warming the earth, he understood the truth at last. No man truly owns the land. The land owns all who dare to live upon it. And perhaps, in that hard truth, there was also a kind of peace.